Hey everyone, welcome to LinkedIn Presents Redefining Work podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt, and today I'm really excited to be joined by Thai Randolph. Thai is a award-winning executive, entrepreneur, producer. You've got a lot of things that you've done in your background, and I'm excited to get into all of that. So let's kind of I'll turn it over to you. What would you like for the audience to know about you before we jump into your background?
Well, thanks for the intro. Super excited to be chatting today. That was a great lead-in, right? I have had now a career that has spanned 2 decades, which is wild to say. It's really been a mix of all of the above, right? I spent the first part of my career in advertising at WPP and Publicis shops. In fact, before WPP or Publicis, my first job out of college was working at a UK-based marketing firm where all of our clients were aerospace and telecom and defense. And then, I got into some of the big holdcos. And then the middle chapter was more about technology at Sony and Meta when it was Facebook. And for the past 7 years, I've been out in LA, really focused on entertainment. Most recently, I was CEO, co-founder, and board member at Kevin Hart's Hartbeat, a global media and entertainment company dedicated to keeping the world laughing. And I always talk about my career as more of a river than a ladder. And so really excited to delve into all things redefining work today.
Yeah. Well, I love the river analogy. And actually, I often use like a lattice over a ladder, but I kind of like river better because it does, it signifies the ebbs and flows and the detours. And I want to talk about that for a little bit because you walked us through, obviously you've worked in different sectors, you've worked in different roles, you've been in marketing and technology, you've been a builder, you've worn a lot of different hats. And I'm always curious, especially for people like you that have had you've kind of reinvented yourself several times over. How intentional was that, right? Like looking back, I think you could always today, looking back, you can probably, draw the line and it won't be a straight line, but you can probably connect the dots of okay, this became this and that led to this. But for some people, they operate in short-term increments where they're like, hey, I'm planning for the next year, maybe 2 years. I tend to operate that way. Mm-hmm. For other people, it's like they had a plan and they had a vision and it's a much longer tail vision. So how do you think about your own career when you look back and you look at the different things that you've done that have led you to this point today?
Absolutely. One of the reasons I use that analogy, river over ladder, is because, there are a lot of parallels. So every river has a source. Often it can be a small spring. And so much of where my career has taken me has been about, really early influences. I grew up on a farm in South Carolina, and there's something, really entrepreneurial about that. When you witness, my dad and my uncles and family kind of living off the land and building as they went, and also there's something inherently scrappy about that. And so I think my approach was informed by much of those early experiences. In college, I really grappled with whether, I would go down this path of being a corporate lawyer or a journalist or a filmmaker. I ended up being a comms major. But interestingly enough, all the reasons why I considered those different paths have played out over the course of my career. Deal making, narrative building, a deep curiosity in understanding how things work. And then I think I'm the oldest child of 7. And so I think there's something that's a natural administrator in taking that, a blended family of 7. And so, all of those things really informed the curiosity and what I pursued. And then much like a river, it is meandering. And sometimes you end up in these bins that you don't expect. There's so many serendipitous moments in my career where, I remember one that was really interesting. I used to work, I was at VML, and there was a gentleman who worked for me who was leaving the company, and he had introduced me on an email without really any context to a former boss of his, and the former boss worked at Sony, and I think the email said something like, you have been two of my best bosses and you should meet. It was very much the type of email that he would send. And he was wonderful, but I didn't always understand how he connected the dots. But
Right.
really brilliant and insightful because we ended up exchanging notes about this, email that didn't necessarily, how did we end up introduced? Turns out, his former boss was on 55 in Madison at Sony. I was on 41 in Madison. We agreed to meet for lunch. And that really led to the exploration of me, leaving that role to go, partner with him. He was the head of the digital business group over at Sony Music at the time. And he had a really interesting point of view on how he wanted to build out what at the time was a proprietary e-commerce platform. And I ended up joining and eventually doing a management buyout of that platform. And I ended up joining that company as VP of consumer marketing and grew and helped scale it and helped carve it out. But it's one of those things you wouldn't have expected. So I couldn't have, that wasn't on my bingo card. And that's much of the latter. And then, rivers, sometimes they're fast and sometimes they're slow and they ebb and they flow. And I think embracing that type of fluidity has really, kept me open to new ideas and new experiences. And so to your point, when I look back at it, the narrative and the theme has been, at my core, I'm a storyteller and a builder. And that's taken lots of different, manifestations over the course of the last several years.
Yeah. Well, I want to key on that builder aspect of your background for a moment, because, in your most recent role as, co-founder and CEO of Hartbeat, you led one of the largest private equity raises, especially for a Black CEO woman in business. And I would love to just learn more about that process, for you. And you can a bit more context as well as kind of bringing the two different platforms together with Kevin Hart. But I would love to just learn more about your insights, fundraising, having those conversations, raising funds for, again, this kind of, comedic force in the industry. And I'd love to just get an inside view of what that experience was like for you.
Yeah. I talk about just the arc of careers. When I started working with Kevin, it was Ashley via Lionsgate, who, I first became acquainted with our work at Sony because they ended up being a client on the platform that we were working on. And I went to Facebook and then I ended up somehow back, with this former client of mine, as they were taking this new platform to market, Laugh Out Loud. It was the streaming service at the time, and it was a joint venture with Kevin. And so it started out as a 50-50 joint venture that was completely operationalized within Lionsgate. As Lionsgate's direct-to-consumer strategy evolved, and as the vision that we had for the company evolved, we ended up architecting a deal to buy out the majority of Lionsgate's interest. We went external or more independent, brought on Comcast as a minority investor for Laugh Out Loud. And then I think in about 2020, Kevin asked me to extend my role as COO, because I was COO of Laugh Out Loud then, to his other venture, Hartbeat Productions. And so it was in the middle of 2021 during the pandemic that we decided to merge those two ventures. And so I spent the back half of 2021 merging the two companies. And the company, both companies profitable, growing at, an amazing clip. And really there was a bigger, sort of 1 + 1 =, perhaps $1 billion or more proposition for the merger of these two. I became the CEO of the newly formed company, January 1, 2022. April of that year, closed the capital raise, the $100 million growth equity infusion from Abry Partners. And I share that context because my experience getting to the point of raising capital and entering the PE space wasn't traditional. I don't have an MBA. I don't have a law degree. And I was this homegrown CEO who had, entered this company as SVP of marketing, had gone from SVP of marketing to SVP of marketing and monetization, then EVP and GM, then COO, then COO of two companies, and the CEO of the newly formed company. And then spent 2 years at that post. And I left the company in November 2023. Maybe my math is wrong. So it's still post-COVID calculations. But When, so when going through that process in the private equity space, there weren't so many folks who did not have my background, right? Most of the folks who I encountered, had come to the CEO path differently. Many of had MBAs, and many of them did not look like me from a gender and, sort of ethnicity perspective, a gender and race perspective. And so while that doesn't seem significant, what you find is that you end up in these rooms and on these calls and no one looks like you. And I personally found myself, really questioning, your competency or your, the appropriateness of yourself in some of those spaces. And during the process is really when I fundamentally realized that something that I now try to evangelize is my experience as an operator, my deep understanding of the business, the fact that I had, built it from the ground up, made me uniquely qualified to do so. And I think often when we look at the process and it's so daunting, whether it's the, taxonomy and the language around fundraising, because it's a whole different regular, or the networking around it and understanding the steps in the process. It can be a really intimidating and daunting, endeavor. And that's even when you're flanked by a powerhouse like Kevin. And after going through that process, I thought, one, was really proud of myself and the team, but it also made me deeply empathetic to other, sort of female founders and fundraisers and people of color who are looking to, pursue capital for their businesses, because I thought that was really a hard process. And if it was that hard for me with this resource, with these resources and this track record and these connections, imagine, that barrier. And the numbers are pretty wild. I think even if you, sort of broaden the aperture and you look at how many women are CEOs of PE-backed companies, it's less than 10%. Yeah. And if you look at the number, and this was, I think these stats were in 2022, so hopefully they've improved, but unfortunately not dramatically. There were under 100 women, Black women, who'd raised over $1 million in the VC space. I mean, those are just super sad statistics. Yeah. Sometimes I think we can be deceived by all of the diversity programs and initiatives, but from a pure stats and facts perspective, there's still a huge disparity that's rooted in pattern matching, that's rooted in access, that's rooted in pipeline. And, so I'm deeply committed moving forward to doing everything that I can to, help break down some of those walls.
Yeah. I mean, so many, and I appreciate that context. And so much of what you're navigating are systems, right, that have been built. You mentioned pattern matching. I mean, you mentioned the demographics of typically the people in those rooms and in those meetings. How do we disrupt that, right? How do we kind of make an easier on-ramp and access to capital for underrepresented leaders who have great ideas, have great businesses, have great operational backgrounds, but again, purely from a pattern matching standpoint or a like standpoint, may not have access in the same way?
I think the first thing to do is acknowledgement. And I used to say it was around acknowledging implicit bias, but actually even that feels inherently, there's blame in even implicit bias. No one wants to be biased. No one wants to think of themselves as prejudiced. So, the first step to solving a problem is admitting that you have one. Then, when you point the finger in someone's face that way, it's really difficult for someone to raise their hand and say, I'm guilty of that. But if we would all acknowledge affinity bias, right? Like attracts like. We all know we operate in communities and tribes of folks that we have some interest with, some similarities to. And so if we acknowledge affinity bias, and that's not, if that's not an inherently bad thing, if that's just a human thing, I think it opens up the pathway to say, okay, well, now I need to be very deliberate about considering ideas, people outside of my normal consideration set or outside of this, sort of very closed, tribe or environment. And the other piece is that, I think we have to be more imaginative. And this idea that if a project, if an opportunity doesn't come packaged in the same wrapping, and that could be a number of things, right? Whether that's sort of runway or track record or composition of the founding team, I think that's going to be really difficult, even in being, becoming a CEO. If you only put someone in that spot who has had that experience, then you are ultimately never going to, that's a natural or fixed barrier that will keep the door closed and keep a circle so small. The other thing it does is it really inhibits innovation. And, I'm encouraged by trends and the opportunity with access that exist with emerging technologies and with the rise of generative AI. There's a promise or a potential for it to be a great equalizer in terms of access, and a great scaler in terms of how folks can enter and build and scale businesses without necessarily have to have the same amount of resources. However, I'm equally as concerned about the same type of pattern matching that's happening with the investment that's going on, in AI. During the dot-com boom, all of the investment was concentrated with, a certain profile of founder. And those people came to rise and rule the internet and ultimately business as we know it. And unfortunately, while, again, there's this huge democratization of access to the tools with AI, there is still probably even a more hyper concentration of the investment in a particular profile of founder with a particular type of network, with a particular type of background. And from that perspective, there is a potential to create, an even greater divide and a greater disparity, in terms of the composition of future founders who are funded for scale.
Right. No, I mean, that's such a great point. I think that when you look at kind of how these LLMs are trained and how they're set up, I mean, they're trained on existing data that is already biased. And so if they're not intentionally kind of debiased as they're developed, and obviously, there's examples of that have gone right. There's examples of that have gone wrong, like Google's, Gemini, rollout earlier this year. So I guess last year now, since we're recording this in 2024. But I'd love to actually spend a few moments on AI, because you have a really interesting kind of dual, I imagine, perspective on AI. On the one side, you are close to creators, and I think there's a natural skepticism or concern that creators may have towards AI, particularly around things like copyright and work product that these models are trained on. But you're also a business executive, and I'm sure through that lens you see lots of opportunities in AI, as there is. So how do you think about AI, both as somebody who is kind of close to the creator space, but also somebody who is a business leader thinking about how to leverage these tools?
I think about AI the same way I think about humans, right? I don't think that any human being is inherently good or bad, but I do think that every human being has an unlimited capacity for good or evil. And that's not absolute. That is often circumstantial, and it depends on the, conditions and, how that human was reared and the environments and how they ended up making choices. And so there's an analogy that could really play out there. And I think with AI, there's an unlimited capacity for good and evil in the entertainment industry and everywhere else. And so, but what I would encourage creators to do, though, is to lean into that. If something is daunting, and that doesn't mean, throw caution to the wind as it pertains to, intellectual property and, all of the really complex frameworks around rights, and particularly around NIL and the creative process at all. But I am saying that if as storytellers, if we have great concern, that we should have great investment in ensuring that we have a seat at the table in how the technology evolves and how it's governed. And you saw a lot of that play out in terms of, the initial attempts to protect creatives and the creative process, during the strikes. But the technology isn't going to slow down. And so I encourage everyone to really lean in. There are certain challenges that the industry has faced that would really cause us to embrace AI when it comes to efficiency and process and being able to scale productions and doing it more effectively when the entire industry has really placed, from a content acquisition and ROI perspective, a much greater focus on budgets and efficiency. But even Sam Altman has said that in this new era of AI, as generative AI scales, some of the most important skills that we as humans can continue to evolve are critical thinking and creativity and our ability to curate. And that is the artist playground. The AI will never have the experience that a human does in the world. They will never have the diverse perspective, the ability to connect with and anticipate what other people feel and think. And so then in that environment, there is a premium placed on creativity, the ability to be able to ask the right questions, and to architect delightful, unexpected outcomes. The promise of generative AI is around scale and possibility, but we understand that that can create a sea of sameness. And so, I think it's about really walking that line in that intersection.
Yeah. I'm curious, you mentioned Sam Altman. When you first saw some of the videos being created by Sora, when they demoed that, what was your initial response as you kind of saw how some of those things came together?
Yeah, the initial response was obviously, right, this doesn't come close to the work of the artists that we work alongside in the field every day. But it was also, wow, if this is the earliest iteration, imagine where this is going to go.
Right.
And so, I think we're all looking back and realizing that these tools are only going to become smarter and better. And so, how we regulate them, how we ensure the responsible use of them over time, and how we lean into really driving the creative output and informing how, humans collaborate and wield these tools, because, that's ultimately what they are, tools, is critical. And so, like I said, any artist who I'm talking to, an executive who I'm speaking to, it is really this encouragement to lean in and explore and be curious. And by the way, and absolutely be cautious, and absolutely be concerned. And because of that concern is the number one reason why we all have to be deeply involved. This will be a much greater technological revolution, a much greater business revolution than anything we've seen in our lifetime. And it's not over time, it's happening in real time. And so where the action is.
I mean, that's kind of the exciting and scary, perhaps, aspect of this. I mean, I'm an optimist and I'm a technologist. So for me, I kind of look at this and I see a lot of opportunities, but there are risks. And the point you just made, I think, is so important that, you look at this is probably the most, significant thing that we've encountered since personal computing and the internet.
Yeah.
Arguably bigger, but also when you look at how that scaled, right? I mean, we had AOL dial-up discs and, we're using our landlines to get on the internet and it was super slow and there was no widespread mobile device. And look at how far we've come in the last 20 years. And, ChatGPT was released to the public in November 2022. And we're already at this place now. And obviously that's just one LLM. There are many where the pace that this change is happening is so fast. And I want to actually connect that to something that I know you're passionate about, which is storytelling. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're also in this interesting, so you have AI, and that is driving a wave of content, AI generated content, and you can comment on, how, human or interesting or good that may be. There's both sides of that, equation. But you also have all of these, digital platforms that even 10 years ago, we didn't. And so at an individual level, when I talk about kind of creators now and storytellers, you have instant global distribution.
Yeah.
You have instant access to tools that will allow you to edit video in creative ways or create content or images in different ways. So the distribution is there and it's frictionless. The mediums and the platforms are there and they're frictionless.
Wow.
And so how do you stand out in that environment as a storyteller, right? Where you have just so much content that you have to rise above to really connect with an audience?
That's a fantastic question, because going back to the first part of what you said, the fundamental thing that we all, I believe, as learners, as workers, as builders have to realize is the and wrap our minds and our processes around is how the innovation clip has accelerated, right? Because to your point, we just had, as humans and as learners, a much longer time to digest and adapt and get up to speed with things. And now I think we all have to figure out different ways and means of learning and how to learn at a clip and, assess and process information at a clip that is accelerated just because of how fast things are moving. And so what does that mean for storytellers? Well, a couple of things to your point. That means everyone's a storyteller. And that's always been true, right? From the dawn of civilization, story is so fundamental to the human experience. It's how we connect. It's how we, sort of maintain history, and how we advance ourselves and our ideas through time. So we've all always been storytellers. Our ability to be able to scale stories as individuals, that level of reach, that level of creativity was really, insulated to a number of really powerful organizations and powerful celebrities. And now with not just the rise of the creator economy and the vast expansion of the creator economy, but just this, mass empowerment of everyday storytellers and individuals across every different platform, we're all competing with everything all the time. And right. I would remind, myself and my teams that even, in entertainment companies, a lot of times you think, well, what else is being released in the theater during this time, or what else is streaming during this time? But in an attention economy where we're constantly, fluidly moving between devices and experiences and having them at the same time with these co-viewing and co-experiential opportunities, then, you're competing with what's on your television and what's in your earbud and, what someone's seeing on a billboard and via goggles all at the same time. And so, and by the way, to be deeply interesting and to gain attention, it doesn't have to be very expensive. It doesn't even have to be very prolific, but what it does have to do is provide value to that consumer at that moment in time. And so fundamentally, even though there's a really complex and fragmented landscape, I think for storytellers and for business builders, it's just a real fundamental basic challenge is what does value creation look like in this ecosystem? How do you provide ultimate value to the person on the other side, understanding that they have a lot to choose from and there is a finite amount of time and attention that we're fighting for. And that's when individuality, authenticity, true connection, and experience still rise to the top. So with all of this noise, ultimately, we pay attention to the same things that we've always paid attention to, things that have meaning for us and value for us.
No, I appreciate that context. And I think your point around the kind of attention economy is so spot on, right? Because we're flooded with content on every platform, on every channel at all times. I think it's more rare to be disconnected right. than to be connected, right? And so that's just the reality that we live in today.
Absolutely.
One thing I'd love to get your perspective on. So a friend of mine, Minda Hartz, is an aspiring screenwriter. She's an author. She's a published author. She's done many books and talks and is now beginning to kind of try to make that segue into screenwriting. Mm-hmm. And, she was curious to get your perspective on, for somebody who hasn't kind of come up through entertainment, hasn't come up through media, does not have those networks, does not have access to the people that can usually accelerate having a script picked up or kind of giving feedback or mentorship. What advice would you have for somebody who's looking to break into the industry, who is maybe moving into the field from somewhere else where they don't have that established kind of network or body of work, specifically in the entertainment space, to bring with them?
Sure. A couple of things. One, there's so many programs out there. I talk about the sea of sameness. There's a need for a real hunger for diverse perspectives, new voices that can really cut through. And there's so many more homes for content. from a more diverse chorus of voices and for new voices. That said, the systems really haven't evolved too much in terms of how you can get the idea heard in the traditional senses. So I would really encourage, though there are a lot of pipeline programs. I mean, I co-founded a program called Women Right Now, and it was at Hartbeat, and it was all around amplifying, diverse voices, particularly Black women in comedy, in partnership with Sundance Institute and JPMC. And what was interesting when we launched that program, I was very deliberate in saying I wanted no barrier to entry. So there was no entry fees, and it was all writers. So we were very deliberate to say, if you were a copywriter or an aspiring screenwriter, or if you'd written something on a Post-it one day, we want to hear from you. And often we would find, when we got to those finalists, sure, there'd be some folks who came from film school and, who had published something, or, there might be a journalist involved, but often these are just people who had really, really good ideas. And so there are a ton of those programs that are out there, far more than, say 5 or 10 years ago. So I would really lean into that. The other thing I would say, or the two others, going back to this level of access and, the creator economy, so often when, you're getting so many submissions through the traditional process, whether it's through, agents and managers and, or programs for folks who aren't represented, it can be hard to kind of cut through as someone who's looking to acquire new content or looking to greenlight or looking to sort of identify new talent. And those digital platforms have been absolutely critical in terms of, sending strong signals through all the noise. And there are so many incredible examples from Issa Rae, whose entire career, and all of the companies in the network that she, has now deployed. And when I say network, I mean these networks of creative companies that she's building. It started out as a web series online that was then picked up, and the popularity of the web series and that proof of concept, and I believe it was distributed on YouTube, translated to Insecure, and then ultimately all of the IP and the opportunities that she's created since then. Quinta Brunson, same scenario. She started out in BuzzFeed and doing skits online, and now has one of the most successful network television shows in history. So I think the ability to get out and create and showcase your work via the mediums that you have, and to build audience. And for artists, often we say, hey, we just want to get our work out there. But I would say it's very critical to understand how to build audience, even in relatively smaller ecosystems or frameworks, because as an artist in this particular distribution ecosystem, you're really going to need to understand how streamers and platforms think about audience if you want to get projects picked up. So if you can figure out how to do that in a grassroots perspective and get real-time audience feedback, it's only going to make you more effective when you get in those rooms. And then the third and final piece of advice I would give is one piece of advice from my own experience. I talked about the transition from advertising into, sort of this tech entertainment space with Sony. That happened because the first thing I did in tech and entertainment was the same function that I was doing in an advertising agency, right? So taking a function and applying it to an industry is a great way to transition from a vertical perspective. So, I was marketing and using emerging media and doing CRM and all of this stuff in an agency setting for CPG and retail brands. And then I took that same subject matter expertise and applied it to the entertainment vertical. And so think about those points of entry where you can use your existing skill set and all that knowledge base to get into the industry. So whatever, her day job is at the moment, how could you leverage that to get into an entertainment company where now at least you're surrounded by, even if you're not writing full time, folks who are like-minded, and you get the connectivity to be able to network within the industry, even if from a different angle.
Yeah. Well, I love that feedback, and you're taking us back to the river, right? As being able to kind of leverage those past skills. And I think, again, you're right. I think especially we're seeing this interesting convergence of these different disciplines that historically had been kind of siloed and separate that are now coming together. And so there's this kind of real alchemy involved when you can bring different skills to different roles and maybe help them see the work in a different way. Yep. And that puts a lot of power in the hands of the individual, of the creator, of the writer, or whatever the role may be, of the business executive, right? It doesn't have to be a creative space. So it's such an interesting time. I love learning more about your background and your experience. If the audience wants to kind of connect with you after the show, what's the best way for them to do that? Are there preferred social channels, website? What's the best way?
I am Thai Randolph everywhere. I am ThaiRandolph.com, Thai Randolph on LinkedIn, Thai Randolph on Instagram, ThaiRandolph.
All right. Well, Thai, thanks so much for your time. I'm excited to see how your work unfolds and what you do next, and appreciate you giving us a window into your world.
Thanks, Lars. This is so much fun.